Welcome to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, independent journalist, Melbourne, Australia. We are continuing the series of academic papers that we have been able to have access to, and the topic is the Macedonian question. This time we are going to share with you an academic paper from Katherine Denkers, and it's titled The Macedonian Question in Classics, the Cultural Ethnicity of Ancient Macedonians. I'll repeat again, The Macedonian Question in Classics, the Cultural Ethnicity of Ancient Macedonians by Katherine Denkers. And it's paper number 05622280. And Katherine begins her paper with the following. The Macedonian question is a term used to define the confounding debate between nations over the name Macedonia and the history implied. The specifics of the question tend to morph depending by which academic discipline it is being investigated. For every discipline, the question poses an engrossing problem, but this is especially true for classics. The discipline is concerned with early years of Macedonian history. In a letter to President Obama, prominent classical scholars have insisted that Alexander III was Greek, while others have written to insist that he was Macedonian. The Macedonian question from the classics perspective, can be broken down into two parts. Were the ancient Macedonians, and specifically Alexander III, Greek? If not, then at what point, if any, did the Macedonians and Alexander III become Greek? The answer to the first part of the question will distinguish how ancient Greek and Macedonian cultures differed in at least three ways. First, a distinction between the Macedonians as a people and the Macedonian kings must be taken into account when judging Macedonian affinities with Greek culture. Leading up to and during the time of Alexander the Great, the Macedonians were not considered a Hellenized people. The issue was not even debated. On the other hand, starting with the reign of Alexander I, there was debate whether the Argids were Greek. The story of the Argid family's Greek descent dates no earlier than the time of Alexander I. The story is not substantiated by other primary sources, which indicates that the story of Greek Argead descent is most likely fictitious. Second, Macedonian and Greek cultures were not synonymous. They differed in politics, society, and possibly languages. And finally, regardless of their heritage, Philip II and Alexander III fostered an appreciation for Hellenic culture, which was passed down to the Diakorai. The second part of the Macedonian question is more difficult to assess. The transmission of cultural ethnology is almost impossible to quantify or trace. In this case, the task is doubly difficult because the available primary sources are predominantly of Greek authorship. Virtually no Macedonian sources survive from this time. Since potential bias must be considered when looking at these sources, any conclusions derived from them are based on deductions. Leading up to the time of Philip II, Greek culture was already in transition and was drifting away from the classical ideas of state and Greekness. During the reign of Philip II and Alexander III, a slow but steady degradation of the political ideals of democracy that was central to classical Greek culture. The Lemnian War was the last gasp of Greek democracy, and the Macedonian monarchy became the government structure used by the Diadochoi. Politically, it was Macedonian culture that took over the Greeks. However, Greek culture continued philosophically and linguistically, and Greek forms were idealized in cities like Alexandria. No easy answer to the Macedonian question exists because the Macedonians were not assimilated into Greek culture. Rather, the definition of what was Greek in the Hellenistic age was broadened to accept cultural attributes that would never have been accepted in classical Greece. It is important for modern scholars to differentiate between the Macedonian people and the Argead royal family, because the ancient Greeks considered the two differently. While it was debated as to whether the Argeads were of Greek descent, the Macedonian people are not referred to as Greek until well after the Romans had conquered the area. Indeed, in one of his letters, Isocrates mentions that Philip II's forefathers had enough insight to rule over a non-Greek people. And the founder of your empire, although he aspired higher than did his fellow citizens and set his heart on a king's power, was not minded to take the same road as others who set out to attain a like ambition. For they endeavored to win this honor by engendering factions, disorder, and bloodshed in their own cities. He, on the other hand, held entirely aloof from Hellenic territory and set his heart upon occupying the throne of Macedon. For he knew full well that the Hellenes were not accustomed to submit to the rule of one man, while the other races were incapable of ordering their lives without the control of some such power. The forefather of Perdiccas, who came with his two brothers from Argos and eventually became the first Argead king of Macedonia. The story of the Argeads' Greek lineage comes from a contemporary of Alexander I, Herodotus. Herodotus also relates how the Elevodiki judged that Alexander I was eligible to participate in the Olympic Games, implying the acceptance of his Greek heritage story. No other sources, however, including the Olympic victor lists of the period, corroborate this story, and it is generally felt that the portrayal of the Argeads as a Greek family in Herodotus is either a Herodotian fable or the result of Alexander I's propaganda. Claiming Greek heritage would be a useful political tool for any Macedonian king, so it's not surprising to find Alexander I using such propaganda after the Greeks emerged as victors of the Persian War. Philip II and Isocrates could be using this lineage story for similar reasons. Not because it is true, but because it would make the Greeks more comfortable in dealing with the Macedonian kings. Interestingly, the Macedonian kings only insisted on their Greek heritage when it was politically expedient. Even if the story contains elements of truth, the reality is that the Macedonians and their kings did not consistently behave as Greeks, and therefore cannot be considered as having participated in Greek culture until around the time of Philip II and Alexander III. A comparison of Macedonian and Greek cultures from the time leading up to Philip II and Alexander III shows how different the two were. They had different political structures. The classical Greek ideal of democracy was based on, this is a Greek word which I'm unable to read, and the Macedonians had a monarchy based on, it's another Greek word, unfamiliar to me. Let's see if we can look that one up. No, it's not in the footnote. They did not share common social practices. They did not share common social practices, said the author of this academic paper, Katherine Denkers. The academic paper, once again, is called The Macedonian Question in Classics, the Cultural Ethnicity of Ancient Macedonians. So, where were we in our text here? A comparison of Macedonian and Greek cultures from the time leading up to Philip II and Alexander III shows how different the two were. They had different political structures. The classical Greek ideal of democracy was based on this word which I am not able to read, and the Macedonian had a monarchy based on another Greek word I am not familiar with. They did not share common social practices. The Macedonians tended to be more boisterous and lavish in their tastes. And evidence shows that the Macedonians did not speak Greek. Or at least, says the author, that their dialect could not be understood by the Greeks. It would be impossible to tell what language the Macedonians commonly used because there are no Macedonian primary sources to verify it. That's what this author says. Unlike the Greeks, the Macedonians had to deal with a harsher continental climate, and we were involved in consistent fighting with the Illyrians, Thracians, I beg your pardon, and the Paeonians. Both of these factors made them a strong and hardy race, but one that did not have much time or inclination to develop a constitutional government or to cultivate artistic disciplines amongst their own. Politically, Macedonia was made up of tribal units that all deferred to the king. Their system of monarchy resembled those of the Germans, as described by Tacitus. That's also in another language, and there is a translation this time. They choose their kings by birth, their generals for merit. These kings have not unlimited or arbitrary power, and the generals do more by example than by authority. If they are energetic, if they are conspicuous, if they fight in the front, they lead because they are admired. Similarly, the Macedonian kings were chosen in part by blood, but mostly based on military leadership and acclamation. Even though the monarchy was not necessarily primogenitory, being of Macedonian blood was definitely a factor when considering who would be king. The story of Philip II's marriage to Cleopatra is an excellent example of the importance of lineage to the Macedonians. Again, we've got a text in Greek, which I'm unable to read or understand. Thank you for the translation below. The most open quarrel was brought on by Attalus at the marriage of Cleopatra, a maiden whom Philip was taking to wife, having fallen in love with the girl when he was past the age for it. Attalus now was the girl's uncle, and being in his cups, he called upon the Macedonians to ask of the gods that from Philip and Cleopatra they might be born a legitimate successor in the kingdom. At this, Alexander was exasperated, and with the words, "But what of me, base wretch? Dost thou take me for a bastard?" threw a cup at him. Alexander III's mother, Olympias, was Epirian, meaning Alexander III was not a full-blooded Macedonian. Clearly, it was an important consideration that any claimant to the throne should be of Macedonian blood. Otherwise, there would be no reason why a son of Philip II and Cleopatra would have been considered as more legitimate than that of Philip II and Olympias in the eyes of Macedonians. Military leadership was another requirement for a Macedonian king. Both Philip II and Alexander III realized this and proved themselves excellent military leaders early in their reign in order to solidify their claim on the kingship. For Philip II, this involved quelling the Illyrians, Thracians, and Paeonians. When Philip II was killed, Alexander III already had an established background of successful military command, but he was required to re-establish his authority all the same. Along with these successes in military matters came the third requirement of a Macedonian kingship, acclamation. The kings were not elected, but they did require the goodwill of and the approval of the people, as usually embodied by the army, in order to succeed. The connection between the kingship and the military is evident following Philip II's death. An army played some role in conferring the kingship on Alexander, as when Alexander of Lyncestis, the son-in-law of the great general Antipater, buckled on his armor and went with Alexander to the palace. Similarly, when Alexander III died, the army made their wishes known by acclaiming Archidaios as their new king. The Diadochi wisely chose not to disappoint the troops and made him co-king with Alexander III's as yet to be born son. With the prevalence of the army and the preoccupation Macedonian culture had with warfare, the Macedonians did not develop a distinct artistic culture. Yet both Philip II and Alexander III had a deep appreciation for Greek culture. It was King Philip who from the very beginning attached great importance to gaining for his cause adherents and friends from among the intellectually preeminent personalities in the Greek states. As part of this policy was the hiring of Aristotle as a tutor to the young Alexander III. And this is where Alexander III acquired his love of Greek culture. That Philip II extended this cultivated culture to the Macedonian people, at least somewhat, is evidenced in Alexander III's speech to his troops. Again, we have a text which is in Greek, which I do and I'm unable to read or understand. Philip found your vagabonds. This is the translation of it. Thanks to the author of this academic paper, and it reads like this. Philip found you vagabonds and poor, wearing sheepskins, most of you, and pasturing your few sheep on the mountains, and having to fight for these without success against the Illyrians and the Tribalians and the Thracians on your borders. Philip gave you cloaks to wear instead of sheepskins and brought you down from the mountains into the plains when he had made you fit to stand to the barbarians, your neighbors, so as to trust for your safety, not in strong places, but your own skill in war. He made you dwellers in cities and a civilized people. Philip II changed the habits of his people from being those of pastoral nomads to those of agricultural city dwellers. He incorporated the ideas of the Greek intellectuals that had been invited to Macedonia. Although the Macedonian cities were not Greek, they were closer than they had been before. The final great distinction between Greeks and Macedonians is the language spoken by the two peoples. It would be impossible to determine with absolute certainty what language the Macedonians spoke. This is what the author says. There simply is not enough evidence, but there is evidence because there's been a lot of evidence, except it's probably not translated in English. A lot of the time, this is me adding that bit of comment. So coming back to what this author says, the final great distinction between Greeks and Macedonians is the language spoken by the two peoples. It would be impossible to determine with absolute certainty what language the Macedonians spoke. There simply is not enough evidence. Certainly, the nobility was familiar with Greek. Aristotle taught Alexander the third, I beg your pardon, and Euripides wrote some plays when he was invited to Macedonia. In the spirit of examining differences between the two cultures, only the argument that the Macedonian speech was incomprehensible to the Greeks will be addressed here, says Katherine, the author of this academic paper. There are two direct references to Macedonian speech in primary sources, one in Plutarch's version of the death of Cletus, and one from a papyrus fragment. The excerpt in Plutarch's occurs when Alexander III looks for his sword to confront the insolent Cletus. Again, we have a text in Greek unfamiliar to me, but one of his bodyguards, this is the translation, but one of his bodyguards, Aristophanes, conveyed it away before he could lay hands on it. And the rest surrounded him and begged him to desist, whereupon he sprang to his feet and called out in Macedonian speech a summons to his corps of guards. This was a sign of great disturbance, and ordered the trumpeter to sound and smote him with his fist because he hesitated and was unwilling to do so. Of course, the Macedonians referred to could simply be a Greek dialect to which Alexander III reverted while under stress and the influence of wine. But it could also be a separate language altogether, in which case Alexander III reverted to it because the Macedonian soldiers did not understand Greek, and he wanted to ensure his orders were being followed. Similar logic is applicable to the other evidence, such as papyrus fragment, which had been attributed to Arians Diadochoi. When Eumenes saw the close-locked formation of the Macedonian phalanx, he sent Xenius once more, a man whose speech was Macedonian, bidding him declare that he would not fight them frontally, but would follow them with his cavalry and units of light troops and bar them from provisions. Obviously, it was imperative that Eumenes' commands be understood, and the only way he could ensure this was to send a man of Macedonian speech, says the author. In politics, society, and language, the Macedonians and their royal family were separate from the Greeks. How then did the barbarian Macedonians come to be considered Greeks by the time of Strabo? A classic Greek would never accept a monarchy like the Macedonian, when the Greek, whoever he might be, was ready to sacrifice everything for the independence he loved so much. Isocrates makes this point to Philip II in one of his letters. When Philip II came into Greece, its democratic ideals had already begun to degrade from within. They no longer supported the same civic virtues. The assembly was directed by the poorer classes, desire for spectacle, homage, and the law courts were being abused, and personal influence was becoming more of a decisive factor in political decisions. Demosthenes complains that the people of Athens were driven in their decisions either by their poverty or by their affluence, but not by any concern for the state. In the same speech, we see that the Athenians no longer participate in their national army the way they used to. The Athenian army was now mostly made up of Greek mercenaries, for the citizen ceased to be a soldier when he ceased to be a politician. Another fundamental convention of the, it's a Greek word, I'm unable to read or understand, that had been overturned was the importance of the individual. Decisions, exploits, and decisions, exploits, and great feats used to be attributed to the city and her people. By the 4th century, this convention had changed, perhaps due in part to the absence of citizen soldiers, and it had become a routine for generals and political leaders to receive honors for every little conquest or popular success. The Greeks had become lax and apathetic in their governing. Philip II's success in conquering Greece can be attributed in part to this very apathy. Having conquered an internally weakened nation, Philip II established the League of Corinth. On the surface, the League appeared to be an alliance of Greek states, with Philip II arbitrating as hegemon, and the aim of this new alliance was meant to be the invasion of Persia. In reality, the League was a tool of appeasement, meant to maintain the status quo in Greece, so that Philip II and Alexander III could use her resources and concentrate on Persia without worrying about the Greeks rebelling back home. While it was important for Philip II avidly to maintain the illusion of democratic control in Europe, since the Macedonian presence there was still new, the importance of the facade slowly diminished for Alexander III over time. The diminishing importance of the League facade can be seen in a comparison of two situations where Alexander III was dealing with the Greeks. The first is the destruction of Thebes, and the second is the decree for the return of the exiles. By quelling the rebellion in Thebes, Alexander III did more than re-establish his authority in Greece so soon after the death of his father. He also reinforced the illusion that the Greeks were still in charge of their own affairs. After the rebellion had been put down, Alexander III, and he is being quoted here, nevertheless, again, it is in the Greek alphabet, and I do not understand the language, nor can I read it. But the English version is calling a meeting of the representatives of the Greeks, put before the Common Council the question what should be done with the city of the Thebans. They related many other details of similar tenor and so aroused the feelings of the council against the Thebans that it was finally voted to raise the city, to sell the captives, to outlaw the Theban exiles from all Greece, and to allow no Greek to offer shelter to a Theban. Alexander III knew that the League would deal with the Thebans in accordance with his wishes. The League had just finished watching him expediently quell a revolution without hesitation, and they would not have presented any resistance to Alexander III at that point in time. However, Alexander III had good reasons for having the decision approved by the League. The sack of Thebes occurred when Alexander III had conquered Persia, and it was still advantageous for him to maintain the illusion of Greek independency. By having the decision arbitrated by the League, he also conferred responsibility upon the Greeks. In this way, he simultaneously achieved his goals, but could not be blamed for the destruction of Thebes, nor was he perceived as interfering with Greek business. The relationship between Alexander III and the Greeks would change. However, once he had accomplished his extraordinary feats in Asia, just before his death, Alexander decided to restore all the exiles in the Greek cities, partly for the sake of gaining fame and partly wishing to secure many devoted personal followers in each city to counter the revolutionary movements and seditions of the Greeks. Therefore, the Olympic Games being at hand, he sent Nicanor of Stagira to Greece, giving him a decree about the restoration, which he ordered him to have proclaimed by the victorious herald to the crowds at the festival. Nicanor carried out his instructions, and the herald received and read the following message. We quote, "King Alexander, to the exiles from the Greek cities, we have not been the cause of your exile, but save for those of you who are under a curse, we shall be the cause of your return to your own native cities. We have written to Antipater about this to the end that if any cities are not willing to restore you, he may constrain them." Quite a few differences exist between this situation and the one at Thebes. First, Alexander III has made absolutely no pretense about who is in command. He wanted something done. He sent his men to do it, and he did not ask the League for their permission or approval. Second, Alexander III is interfering directly with the policies and laws of the city-states the way an absolute ruler would. And the illusion of Greek control is no longer present at this address. Finally, he doesn't even allow his orders to be carried out by the Greeks. He has placed them under the supervision of Antipater, a Macedonian, who may constrain them. At this point, the Greeks had enough. Shortly after Alexander III died, they launched the Hellenic or Lamian War. As is true of every war, the causes of the Lamian War were varied, but the purpose can be defined simply and obviously as anti-Macedonian. The Greeks did not want to be under Macedonian domination anymore, and they were hoping to use the confusion surrounding Alexander III's death to their advantage. The Lamian War was possibly the Greeks' last true chance at freedom from the Macedonians, but they were defeated in their attempt when Leosthenes was killed. After that, garrisons were installed in the Piraeus and Munichia. Demosthenes, one of the foremost anti-Macedonian leaders in Athens, committed suicide rather than surrendering to Antipater, and an oligarchy was put in place by the Macedonian rulers. From this point forward, Greek democracy gave way to Macedonian monarchy. The Diadochoi continued using Macedonian practices such as restricting access to the ranks of heteroi, those closest to the king, to Macedonians, propagating stories of the king's divine ancestry and the traditional practice of acclamation. Since the reforms of Philip II, the Macedonian king named those closest to him his heteroi, or friends. They were his closest generals and first commanders. Alexander III had his own set of friends, or heterois, who would later become the Diadochoi, and they continued the practice when they later became kings. Interestingly, the majority of the Hetairoi under the antagonists from Demetrius I to Perseus were consistently Macedonian. Roughly 70% of Alexander III's Hetairoi were Macedonian, a number that dropped down to 50 under Antigonus Gonatas, but then returned back to 71% at the end of Perseus' reign. Even though Greeks were incorporated into Macedonian government life, it was primarily the Macedonians who were given the highest governmental positions. Thus, there was always a divide between the Macedonians and the Greeks in politics, even up until they were defined as one people by Strabo. Something that the Diadochoi learned from Alexander III was the benefits of deification, and so they started placing greater emphasis on their divine ancestry. Ptolemy Sota claimed descent from Heracles and Dionysus, Seleucus from Apollo and Heracles, and the Attalids also counted Heracles as one of their ancestors. They adopted rule cults tied to their families, similar at the start to Alexander III's family, who practiced the Argaic rites. Some of the Diadochoi even professed to belong to the Argead line. The Ptolemies specifically claimed to be descendants from Heracles Argaidae. So we are continuing this paper, which is an academic paper. I wish to remind you in case you missed it at the beginning. It's a paper written by an academic whose name is Katherine Denkers, and it's titled The Macedonian Question in Classics, the Cultural Ethnicity of Ancient Macedonians. We're almost finished with the paper. Finally, the Diadochoi adopted one of the most central conventions to the Macedonian monarchy, the acclamation of the king by the army. The first of these was the acclamation of Antigonus Monothalmus and his son Demetrius by the Macedonians in 306 before Christ, and they were soon followed by the others. What follows here is a text in Greek, which I'm unable to read and share with you. Nevertheless, I will give you the translation below it. On account of this very notable exploit, the army began to call both Antigonus and Demetrius kings as their own kings. Aridius, the son of Philip and Olympias, and the two sons of Alexander were now dead. Ptolemy's army also saluted him as king, lest by inferiority of rank he should be deemed less lofty than the victors in the late battle. Thus, for these men, similar consequences followed contrary events. All the others followed suit, and all the satraps became kings. Similarly, Ptolemy Serranus was acclaimed by Lysimachus and Seleucus, Macedonian guards, after he had killed Seleucus, I beg your pardon. This institution continued for a long time, even until 283 before Christ, when Seleucus wanted to ensure Antiochus would be accepted as his heir. He presented him to the troops, explained what he wished, and was answered with acclamation. Although they ruled as Macedonians, Philip II and Alexander III both had an appreciation of Greek culture, and their appreciation was transmitted to the Diadochoi. Greek culture did not end with classical Greek democracy. Rather, it was merged with Macedonian-style monarchy. Alexandria is the most obvious result of this transmission of Greek culture by the Macedonians. The Alexandrian literary circle of the 3rd century before Christ was the most brilliant of the post-classical schools. Alexandrian science, Alexandrian mathematics and mechanics, Alexandrian scholarship and literary criticism were epoch-making in the development of knowledge. And each of these fields had their origins in Greek thought, says the author. Alexander III may have founded Alexandria himself, but it was under Ptolemy Soter that the port city became the cultural center of the Hellenic world. In order to achieve this distinction, Alexandria had to acquire the best works of scholarly thought, which meant acquiring Greek thought. The forms of Greek education based on Aristotle's Lyceum were adopted in Alexandria through the influence of the exiled Demetrius of Phaleron. Classical Greek thought was only used as a basis for the schools in Alexandria. The general feeling was that classical culture had passed on, and the process of rebuilding meant looking back to the achievements of the classic past, examining them, using their skills and techniques as a base for the development of any new artistic endeavor. The continuing influence of Greek culture under Macedonian rule in cities like Alexandria, this is the Alexandria in Egypt, is one of the reasons why Greek became the, we've got a Greek word again, I'm not familiar and don't understand the meaning, of the Hellenic world. One of the results of the genesis of the so-called Greek word, which we are unable to read or understand, is that many people who would earlier have been considered as barbarian, like the Macedonian rulers, would now be considered Greek based on the language they spoke. Greek was a logical choice for the, there's that Greek word again, of the new Hellenic world, because it had already made itself known to the Mediterranean world by this time, and because it was the language of scholars. As early as the 10th century before Christ, and possibly even the 11th century, says the author, the Aeolians and Ionians had established colonies on the west coast of Asia Minor. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Ionians had banded together and had mostly taken over the Aeolians. Also, these centuries marked the first appearance of Syro-Hittite goods in Ionian colonies, which means there was established contact between the peoples. Since the Greeks were sailor merchants and sometimes pirates, there would have been ample time and opportunity for other cultures and peoples to be at least exposed to the Greek language well before the Hellenistic age. The second reason why Greek developed into this Greek word, which we don't understand, is that it was the language used by the best scholars of the time. So it was already established as the language of the educated. I suspect, looking at the letters K-O-I-V-N, it could refer to the word koine, the old Macedonian language, but that's my addition to this. It's surprising that there's no translation of that word and other words that have been used in this paper, this academic paper. Nevertheless, that it is what it is. The second reason why Greek developed into the koine is that it was the language used by the best scholars of the time, so it was already established as the language of the educated. And Socrates states in English, and Athens, it is that has honored eloquence, which all men crave and envy in its possessors. For she realized that this is the one endowment of our nature which singles us out from all living creatures, and that by using this advantage, we have risen above them in all other respects as well. And she knew, furthermore, that whether men had been liberally educated from their earliest years is not to be determined by their courage or their wealth or such advantages, but is made manifest most of all by their speech, and that this has proved itself to be the surest sign of culture in every one of us, and that those who are skilled in speech are not only men of power in their own cities, but also held in honor in other states. This attitude is corroborated by Philip II's choice to give Alexander III a Greek education with Aristotle. The Greek influence and language then trickled down to the Diadochoi, who then made the Greek language popular and established it as the language of the educated in Alexandria. Finally, the long sequence of events had led to the answer of the second Macedonian question. At what point did Alexander III and the Macedonians become Greek? The possible answer proposed here is that they started to become equated with Greeks around the same time Greek was accepted as the koine, I think that Greek word means. Originally, language was the only differentiation between Greeks and the barbarians. This onomatopoeic term, because of the importance of language in defining cultural behavior, it quickly became and remained an evaluative description of non-Hellenic behavior and attitudes. Once the Greeks had lost their political institutions and freedoms to Alexander III and the Diadochoi, the term Greek had lost some of its political and cultural implications and reverted back to a more basic differentiation. Thus, again, we've got a sentence in Greek. I do not read Greek and I do not understand the language. The Macedonians of the Hellenistic age shared this intelligence in the form of the language and culture, and so could be ascribed the Greek name. The Macedonian question, says the author, when looked at from a classics perspective, is a daunting one. It is also a misleading one, because it implies that somewhere in their history, the Macedonians progressively became more like the Greeks, culminating in their amalgamation into the Greek culture. In reality, it was the opposite. The Greeks slowly lost their institutions, which defined them as Greek, to Macedonian imperialism and became progressively more Macedonian. Eventually, the definition of what was Greek lost the inclusive political and cultural implications. So that term broadened and encompassed those peoples it never had before, the Macedonians. Well, that is the complete academic paper by Katherine Denkers, titled The Macedonian Question in Classics, the Cultural Ethnicity of Ancient Macedonians. Unfortunately, this paper does not include a date of publication, so I'm unable to give you that. We don't know when it was published, but we can certainly look into that. There are some footnotes in some pages and references to the year 2009. Just looking through, 2009 seems to be the latest or the most recent year that's being referred to in the footnotes. I do not see anything after that date. So it is possible, we can assume that this paper was done after 2009. So once again, letting you know that this was a paper by an academic whose name is Katherine Denkers. It's titled The Macedonian Question in Classics, the Cultural Ethnicity of Ancient Macedonians. For your information and reference, it is your understanding of this paper which will enable you to see the perspective of Katherine Denkers that is contained in this paper based on her research. There are many references to books that have been written, Like she herself said in the beginning of this paper, I would like to perhaps reread some of it, where she states that most of the information or the research that she has done when looking into this topic has come from Greek resources, hardly or no Macedonian resources. So based on that one, you can draw your own conclusions about it. I won't be the one telling you what to believe, but I can certainly tell you that my own background is Macedonian, has always been and always will be. And that does not mean that I am Greek or that Macedonia is Greek, and that ancient Macedonia was certainly not Greek. You've heard me read the paper from Katherine Denkers in relation to the Ptolemy family, Philip II, Alexander III, and how they were able to be the kings and the rulers of that time in the Balkan Peninsula, or what we refer to as Macedonian people, the Macedonian Peninsula. So thank you once again for your attention. Thank you for bearing with me. It has been a long video. Nevertheless, I felt it was important that I bring it to you as a whole rather than separating it into parts. Once again, thank you, and I shall see you soon. Silvana Pavlovska, thank you again.